This is In Hindsight, half a century of research discoveries in Canadian history, presented by Dr. Donald B. Smith and produced by the Ontario Historical Society.
Today's episode is a very, very rich one in terms of records and a historian's dream, a cache of letters. A modern historian's dream, have the letters transcribed and on the web. Well, that's the case in this episode today. We've got 550 letters of a couple, Ontario born and raised, but who moved to Calgary. So it's an Ontario, Alberta story, 550 letters. It's a two-way story because we've got his correspondence and her correspondence, and it's incredibly rich. The decade, the 1910s, the two-way exchange between Fred Albright and Evelyn Albright. Evelyn was she was a clever young woman. She had just graduated from Victoria College in the University of Toronto, English and history. And Fred, he was 7 years older. He had graduated earlier in political science, and he'd come first to Calgary. He'd come actually with his good friend, John Brownlee. They were good pals from Victoria College, and they came out. They'd looked for articling jobs in law. They were going to become lawyers. They did briefly to make money for school. They taught school, but for university, I should say, to make money for university, they paid for their education, whatnot. Now they have their degrees and they're going to article in law. That's what both men have decided that it's going to be their career. So they come to Calgary and Vancouver briefly, but then Calgary was the one that impressed them. Calgary was on the upsurge, a tremendous boom, and the future was here. So John Brownlee, Jack to his friends, and Fred Albright, they decide to apply for articles. They get in with good firms, and they'll spend the next several years articling in law in Calgary. Evelyn, though, is back. She finishes her university, and then she goes to her parents are living in the Niagara Peninsula. Her father was a Methodist clergyman, and she joins them and teaches school, helps in a local school. But she has already met Fred, and they not so much romantic. You see the correspondence. It's delightful because you see it's just sort of coming along nicely. The romance is building. And Fred would get back to Ontario and he'd be able to see her. And things are moving along. But actually, Evelyn is fascinating because she's, in many respects, she's representative of her age, but in others, she's well ahead of her own. That is, for example, with marriage, she was very hesitant. She was an independent thinker, and she didn't want the thought of being married and just the restrictions of that were frustrating to her. And she, frankly, it's all in the letters. I don't want to spoil any of it. It's a frank exchange between Fred and Evelyn. And eventually, though, Fred convinces her that he's a progressive thinker and marriage won't be the drudgery that she is fearful of, and they do get engaged, and things at that point are moving along. So all of this is in the letters, 550 of them. The originals are all at the regional library at Western University in London, Ontario, and it's thanks to an extraordinary woman, a volunteer in the museum, in the regional history library, I should say. It's thanks to Lorna Brooke, who has transcribed them and put introductions to various sections of their lives together, the letters that pertain to those sections, and done just a wonderful job. And they are all on the web. So we're just blessed. And in the written text, all the background details are provided, the web link and what have you. So just a treasure trove. That's how we're starting today. Different start. First time we've done this before. And it's about this rich collection of letters on the 1910s, Alberta, Ontario, female-male exchange. and really, really rich. And I don't think I can think of anything as rich for the early 20th century as the Albright letters. Now, this enormous collection, we've got to take us. We can't possibly in this, this short oral report on this collection. We can't do it justice because there's so many aspects to it. So the historian you have to have a perspective. You have to have a special interest. We can't, if we're going to come out of this alive, we're going to have to focus on one aspect. And of course, with my research background and my personal interest, so much is the historian's personal interest that determines what subjects are picked and what research is done. With my background and interest in race relations, that is the angle I'd like to stress. And we'll look at just racial attitudes as come through the letters, not in an intensive way. That's for students to follow up. There's as I mentioned before, there's treasure trove for term papers in this collection, and on many subjects. But this race relations will be the underlying thread today. Now, Fred and Evelyn. Overall, there's a quote. One of my favorite books on Western history, my favorite author, who comes from Winnipeg, but actually lived in Calgary for the latter part of his life, incredibly successful, popular writer. It's a second career for him. His name is James Gray. And James Gray in the 70s wrote several barn burners, books. Red Lights on the Prairies probably is the most famous. He did very thorough work. He was a popular writer, but he did very thorough newspaper work, and also had a great life experience. So his books are interesting. The book, I want to just take one quote from it. It's The Roar of the 20s, Study of Western Canada in the 20s, published in 1975. And it's just, here we go. I'm going to read it slowly because it sort of is the theme for what follows. To be British and Anglo-Saxon and Protestant on the Western prairies at the onset of the 1920s was not only the best thing. To be British and Anglo-Saxon was the only thing. Isn't that wonderful? This is a day in which English-speaking Protestants are top dog, and everything, doors are open, but for other groups, not so. And through the correspondence, we'll find traces of that. Well, just quickly, Fred and his best friend, Jack to his intimates, Brownlee, come west. 1908, the article here, they are called to the Alberta bar in 1912. 1912, by the way, is a very important year in Calgary. It's the first Calgary Stampede. And Fred was there. He writes back to Ontario telling Evelyn all about it. And that's in the written text. You have to wait to see that. But anyways, they're doing well. Now, this was a land of opportunity for English-speaking Protestant, professional. This was terrific. John Brownlee would, after becoming a full-fledged lawyer, would become a solicitor for an important grain company, and later chief executive officer of it. And eventually, in 1925, he was elected premier of Alberta. So there's wow. And Fred himself, after 3 years of law, his article finished in 1912. He becomes a lawyer that same year. Well, in just 3 years after that, he is the leader of the Alberta temperance movement to make Alberta dry, ban alcohol, and he was also, I mean, it's only 3 years a lawyer. He helped frame the Alberta Temperance Act. So, and a highly respected lawyer. So only in a couple of years they just were up and at it. Fred, the noted prohibition advocate, and John Brownlee beginning this corporate and eventually extremely successful political career. Now, a little bit know our atmosphere, please. What we'll do is, well, there's a phrase, social Darwinism, race theory. These are phrases to describe racial attitudes at the time. And it was common practice, in fact, at the University, common belief, that there was something to innate intelligence and temperament in races. In short, to put it in the most popular way, there were superior and inferior races. And this is commonly accepted. I mean, it's so absolutely nauseating and objectionable to us today, but we have to realize that's the background. This had quasi-scientific endorsement. And people like, well, Brownlee and Albright, I mean, that's in the background of their minds. A wonderful quote, just to illustrate this point, is another Calgary lawyer who would be very successful indeed. His name was Bennett, R.B. Bennett. And R.B. Bennett, for example, gave a talk in 1914. And the talk was, why did Britain rule over countries like India and Egypt? And here's what Bennett said in 1914. He was a prominent provincial conservative at this point. Later, he'd go federal, and he'd become Prime Minister of Canada in the early 1930s. Well, this is the same man, R.B. Bennett, in 1914. And he says, in this talk, he said, okay, why did Britain rule over countries like India and Egypt? Quote, we are there because under the providence of God, we are a Christian people that have given the subject races of the world the only kind of decent government they have ever known. End of quote. There you go. That's pretty enthusiastic, isn't it? And British Empire, of course, is very, very, the feeling of that for Britain in English-speaking Canada is very strong. We are Britons overseas, and that's part of the background here. Now, this is particularly hard on other groups. It really is. And we'll quickly just review just a quick sketch, and then we'll get actually to some direct quotes from the correspondence. People like Fred and John Brownlee had no idea of the Indigenous peoples. Calgary had grown from 4,000 to 44,000 from 1901 to 1911. That was a tenfold increase. The original inhabitants who'd been here for 10,000 years were totally forgotten. And economically, they were in terrible shape. Oh, that was because of a number of factors, but primarily the explanation of their independence, that a buffalo was gone. The great herds were gone by the early 1880. The great herds were gone, period, and on the Canadian side of the border by 1880. And this was the mainstay of the economy of the Plains First Nations. So they were devastated. And there were other factors as well, the arrival of settlers and dispossession and whatnot. And in fact, the treaties were not being observed. In fact, the treaties were forgotten. And I'll make a stronger point of that shortly. So it really was not very, very good times for those not of the British Protestant persuasion. I'll give you a quote. Well, there could be lots of them. Go, just dip in the newspapers in the 1910s. You'll find oodles of them. Most objectionable, I warn you again, but I'll give you one. This is the Albertan. That was Calgary's morning newspaper. 6th of April, 1911. A direct quote which reflects this attitude. And the quote reads, we do not want a colored Alberta. Close out the yellow man, the red man, and the black man. They are not good settlers. They cannot become good Canadians. Unbelievable, isn't it? That's a major Calgary newspaper. And all kinds of other examples can be given. This was the zeitgeist of the time, the superiority of the British. And it was just the ruling dominant outlook. There were small minorities in Calgary. Small Jewish community, about 600 people. There were several hundred Chinese residents. And really, though, that was about it. The rest were of British background. America, by the United States, a great many, mind you, but primarily then their heritage was British. Protestants outnumbered Roman Catholics by roughly 8-1. And this is all reflected. The names of the schools are named after, our city schools are named after imperial statesmen and members of the royal family. There's annual celebrations of Empire Day. Great fuss is made when the royal visitors. The Stampede, the royal visitor for the Stampede in 1912, for example, was the Duke of Connaught, who was then Governor General of Canada, who was Queen Victoria's favorite son. The central figure in the early 20th century was King Edward VII, celebrated by Calgarians on the moment of his coronation in 1902, covered incidentally by Annie Glenn Browder, who we've already introduced in a previous episode. And King Edward VII was mourned by these same citizens at the time of his death in May of 1910. So very British, that's clear, and really seems puzzling now that there would be such enthusiasm, but that's it. That's the whole background of it. Attitudes towards the First Nations, I've already suggested, were not good. And I'll just reinforce that a little bit more because we've got some observations I'd like to introduce on that score of the Indigenous peoples a little bit more, because Fred has a comment here that I'd like to bring in here. And in fairness, though, before I go any further, before making a list of these remarks, which are just so typical of the age, we must understand that these people, the Albrights, of course, and others, were prisoners of racial attitudes of the time. Prisoners, just as in many ways we're prisoners of current attitudes as well. So to be fair, that's just, I'm not going to take this aside, but just think of the environment, for example. What possibly are people going to say a generation from now about our ideas about the environment, our conduct with the environment? Well, I leave that to your thoughts, but I personally, historian cannot predict the future, but I'm not too optimistic that our scorecard will be very good. Well, certainly on the racial attitudes, the previous generation of 100 years ago had serious deficiencies. There's one exception in Calgary. That was the leader of Calgary's social world, the iconic head of Calgary's social world, the Châtelaine of Beaulieu, now Lougheed House, and a National Historic Site. That's the house of James and Belle Lougheed. That's now a National Historic Site. Well, the Châtelaine, the queen of the Calgary social world, was Métis. Isn't this fun? History's always, I just live for these moments when there's a surprise, a big one. Belle was the social, rich background family, fur trade family, the Hardistys. Her dad was a chief factor in Mackenzie River Valley. Her uncle was chief factor at Fort Edmonton. He was reputedly the richest man in Western Canada in the 1880s. Senator Hardisty, he became Senator Hardisty. Anyways, this family was of great prominence, and they were the rulers of the previous era. But now with all the settlements, they've outnumbered and whatnot. But Belle still, though, was prominent because her husband, James Lougheed, was involved in politics, and he had become actually a very successful federal politician from Calgary, and he became Minister of the Interior, very senior post in 1920, 21, 22. So her family was, and they had the mansion in Calgary, now Lougheed House, National Historic Site. So these people were prominent. So, but what did Belle, like, okay, she's got, on both sides, both her mother and father had Indigenous background. And what does she, how does she classify herself? Well, in this atmosphere, this stifling atmosphere about the importance of race and what have you. What was Belle's response? It wasn't an escape, because in the 1901 census, you had to identify. It was color-coded. You had to identify your racial background. And, well, Belle identified herself. She listed herself as white in the 1901 census, but she was Indigenous background. But it just shows you the pressures and who can condemn the really, she was culturally, she was living a life of a European woman and married, and children were going to European schools, or I should say Canadian schools. And so the Indigenous link was still there, mind you, but not as strong as it had been. And anyways, she identified as white. It just tells you that, but she was Indigenous. So I'm not, we can't stay with it, but I just wanted to tell you, this is quite a subtle story. Now, with the Albrights, now let's just get specific, because our job here is to we want to look at them in particular because of this rich correspondence. And you can do all kinds of other searches with these 550 letters. You can look at perceptions of women. Incidentally, I've got to say this. Evelyn is so interesting. because she was stridently in favor of having women having the vote and of women's rights, and a bit off the mark with her racial attitudes, I must be the first to admit. But honestly, she's 21st century in her perception of the rights of women to equality. Another rich discovery in historical work is the surprises. Nobody's perfect, not by certainly through the lenses of today. Something's always a little bit different than it was that is in our day, but nevertheless, it's a rich experience, and it's an adventure. These letters are an adventure. Let's leave it at that. Well, let's get specific. And here we go. These are very outstanding people. They're both involved in the Methodist Church in Calgary, now United Church of Canada, and doing good social work and all. But they are people of their own age, of their own generation. And here we go, some racial attitudes. This is an example in the correspondence, February 1914. And I must say that, you see, we're very strong when Evelyn's in Ontario and Fred's in Calgary, or when Fred's traveling and when Fred's in the army and he's writing back home, because there's correspondence. Of course, when they're together, well, there's always some deficiency. When they're together, there's no letters because they're talking to each other in person. Well, anyways, Evelyn was, I believe, she was away at this time in Ontario or something of that sort. And anyways, Fred writes her. They're very good correspondence, and just telling her about what's happened. He's just gone to hear, the King Lear at the Grand Theatre, Calgary's best theatre. Well, built by the Lougheed family, and Bell was always in her box whenever possible to watch productions, Bell Lougheed. Any case, this production was King Lear. It's February the 4th. And Fred writes to Evelyn, and this is, honestly, I'm just repeating what's in the letter, and by today's standards, of course, it makes you shiver. But again, please remember the context. Here we go. Last night, I noticed in one seat 2 Greeks, 2 Canadian girls of very good family, a mulatto, and a couple Italians. Many other races were represented within a very small radius. End of quote. The Calgary lawyer did not approve of this, quote, indiscriminate assembly of extremely diverse classes, end of quote. He went on to add, quote, this is one disadvantage in taking seats anywhere but in the best part of the house. I wouldn't want to take any lady unless I could afford the better seats for this reason. End of quote. My goodness. Well, more. His attitude towards the Chinese was contradictory. He mentioned in a letter to Evelyn on September the 7th, 1913, of helping once a week with the Methodist mission to the Chinese in the city. The mission worked to teach the Asians English and to introduce them to Christianity. Well, that sounds okay, introducing them to English especially. Yet, in another note, Fred rejoiced, and fasten your seatbelts with this, he rejoiced that he had found the Empress Cafe did not employ Chinese labor. Quote, the dishes are clean, the food well cooked and reasonable in price, and there is only white help in the kitchen. My gosh, hard to believe, isn't it? But that's it. As for the First Nations, he hardly recognized them at all. He overlooked the fact that there was a Treaty 7, which had recognized Indian reserves as First Nation property. Here was a lawyer. He didn't recognize they had treaty rights. With several friends, he trespassed on the neighboring Sarcee or Tsutsina Reserve, hoping to stake an oil claim on their land. This is unbelievable, the naivete. Oh, as he frankly admitted to Evelyn on October 18th, 1913, quote, now we were, they did some game hunting too. Now we are violating the law in 2 particulars. We had no license for shooting game, and the searching for oil development on their property was also off base. So Fred writes, we were violating the law in 2 particulars. We had no license, and shooting on the Indian reserve is forbidden. I hope you don't think we were terribly wicked. This is extraordinary. Well, it's all there in the correspondence. And that's what makes it. It's just not it's something that's set in writing, and it really gives you a very good understanding of First Nations resentment and discontent with this treatment, this inferiority, and this Indian Act reservation. The Indian Act we covered already. We're going to be doing Duncan Campbell Scott very soon, and that's going to remind us of the straitjacket of the Indian Act. Well, that's pretty well introduced things. There's a pecking order amongst races. Those colored quotation marks people are not given any kind of respect. It's very tough for them. The Protestant, but if you're Protestant English Canadian, the world's your oyster, to use the phrase, and that was the case for Mr. Brownlee and Mr. Albright, and for their generation. It was something, but that was not. Some things are going extremely well, but the whole thing turns, and quickly now we're getting near the end. The whole situation is changed. They marry, and they have but it's a very short marriage because of the war and the letters. They resume with the war, of course. Fred he enlists, and here is another aspect, which is the mixture of admirable and questionable is repeated. Fred didn't want to go as an officer. And mind you, he had a university degree, and he was a lawyer. It wouldn't have taken hard. Wouldn't have been hard for him to wrangle himself into an officer's position and going overseas. He wanted to fight. He believed in supporting the British Empire and all, and it was a very patriotic act. And so he did. He enlisted, but not as an officer. He went as a private to be with the ordinary people. So it's extraordinary. Just extraordinary. And then he did training, but he still doesn't. He becomes a sergeant, actually, in England. And but I don't know. That's pretty rough. The letters are full of it. There's lots of folks that love the military history, and it certainly is a good story. The military letters are really interesting, and the hardships. But he doesn't complain. He just keeps at it. He joined the army, driven by a sense of duty and honor, and went as a private. Was a sergeant. As a sergeant, he left with the 50th Battalion for England, then France. He fought his first and last battle at Passchendaele. That was it. He died in his first military exchange in 1917. Now, into the last. And again, I really am, there's so much more that can be done. And I leave it to you, listeners. You just have to go on the web. The letters are there. Just one of the last letters that Fred sent home. The family, Evelyn Kelly was her maiden name. Evelyn Kelly Albright and Fred were close friends of the Coutts family. And the Coutts, good friends. Fred mentioned on a letter in August, he said he was actually just about to leave Canada for England and then eventually for France. And he says, he asked his buddy, George Coutts, to mention him to a special friend. That was George Coutts' son, David. And he said, Fred writes, "Remember me to David and give him an extra good night hug for me. Good night hug and kiss." Well, Fred left from England. He went to Flanders. He was there in September 1917. And, well, just really, I leave it to you. The bombardments and the lice and the rats, and these letters are censored. Censored letters have all the rawness of it. It's just like reading about the Ukraine front today, which is horrifying. It's all in Fred's letters. Well, Evelyn keeps up. She writes regularly. And Sunday, mid-October, she wrote Fred of a church service at Central Methodist, to which she had taken young David Coutts that morning. Wow, it's really poignant. Fred never received that letter. His life had already ended. On Monday, November 12th, Evelyn received a church telegram from Ottawa. It's the death notice. I'll leave it to you to read the full version. Just a bureaucratic note. Fred's been killed. They don't even know when. Killed in action between October 23rd and 26th, 1917. And the letter from the director of records. Oh my gosh. Wow. Evelyn's life changed forever. Well, she was a determined woman. And she knew Fred expected her to continue. And so what did she do? She was clever, bright, hard worker. She articled to become a lawyer in Calgary, and she succeeded. She became the second woman lawyer in Alberta in 1920. Well, my personal connection, though, is there as well. I came to Calgary, as you know, from episode 1 and 2. I came in, especially 2. I came to Calgary in 1974, in the summer. Very shortly after, quotation marks, landing, I got involved in the Chinook Country Historical Society of the Alberta Historical Society of Alberta. Now, I kid you not, the president in 1975 was David Coates. Circle is complete. I met the man who was mentioned in one of Evelyn's last letters to her husband, who was killed at Passchendaele in Flanders, 1917. Thank you.